are listening to Nate the Hate on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, and Google Podcast. Be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you have not already. And with that, I'd like to welcome in my co-host, Modern Vintage Gamer.
What's going on, Nate? It's great to be here because we got some stuff to talk about.
We do have some stuff to talk about, and it has to do with the recently released RPG of the year. No, not that one. Talking about Baldur's Gate 3.
Wait, what was the one you were talking about?
I don't know, something to do with stars in a field.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
The game that, we're going to go back to playing as soon as we finish recording.
Right.
But yes, we're going to talk about Baldur's Gate 3 because there's been a lot of discussion around this game. And a lot of the discussion happened to focus around the now released PlayStation 5 version, but also the Xbox version, as there was a period of time of great uncertainty as to when the product would be coming out on the Xbox Series line of platforms. And we did get an answer to that just a couple of weeks ago when Larian and Microsoft had what appears to be a meeting at Gamescom, and they came out and said with great pleasure that Baldur's Gate 3 will be coming to Xbox in the calendar year of 2023, though as of recording, they have not officially given a release date or a release window for the title.
Yeah.
But honestly, it wouldn't surprise me all that much if Baldur's Gate 3 released on the Xbox before the month of September concludes, though it could come later. It all depends on, I believe, the certification system that Microsoft has and letting the game go through lot check and such. But it seemed as though, based on Larian's own comments, that the game was finished and the only thing holding up release had been the local split screen co-op option, which we will discuss later. So if that was the only feature that was holding back release, it stands to reason that they could feasibly bring it to the Xbox at any point in time between now and really the end of the month. It all comes down to that lock check system.
I agree, Nate. I think the game is probably about 99.9% buttoned up. The only work that Larian probably had to do was to essentially remove the split screen functionality from the game and ensure that nothing else is broken. So they're probably, as we speak, to be honest, they're probably going through a QA pass with the intent of going to final submission. And you're right. I think the Xbox version, I mean, they did tweet out, I believe, I can't remember who it was from Larian. Someone from Larian did tweet out when the announcement was made that they had a meeting with Phil Spencer and Xbox at Gamescom. They did say that the game was coming out in 2023. So we have that commitment. That's firm. But yes, I think that we're probably going to see this game a lot earlier than what people think on Xbox. And I wouldn't be surprised, like you said, if it comes out before the end of September. I think the only thing they really need to do is make sure that the removal of the split screen stuff, co-op, isn't breaking the game negatively in some way. So yeah, I would say it's right behind the PlayStation 5 version.
And you would imagine if you were Microsoft or even Larian in this situation, you want these to release as close to each other as possible, meaning the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox version.
Yep.
Because if you're Microsoft, you now recognize the importance of this release, which is why you had the meeting with Larian at Gamescom to try to figure out a solution, because the game has taken the gaming industry by storm. Quite a surprise. Even Larian themselves were surprised by the amount of players that had committed to the game on Steam when it came out on PC, where they had only set up their servers to handle a load of around, I believe it was 100,000, and they had eclipsed over 900,000 people in the first day, far exceeding those expectations. And some leaks out of, I believe it was China, suggest that the game had already sold in the area of 5 million copies, I believe. And that is simply astonishing. And that's before it came to home console. So if you're Microsoft and you have had this meeting and discussion with Larian and you recognize that it was coming to the PlayStation 5, at that point when the meeting was had, it's going to be 2 weeks later. I'm sure a point of discussion was, how soon can you get it on our platform? Because we don't want to give Sony too much time with it. We don't want them to have, for lack of better terminology, an exclusive timed release of a month or two. You want to limit that as much as you can. And
Right.
if they can have the game on Xbox before September expires, I would consider that a win for the Microsoft camp, that you're also getting the game very timely and you didn't give Sony necessarily an edge in that lead up to the home console release, where everyone who has interest in the game is just going to say, well, I'm going to buy a PlayStation 5 for the game, or I'm just going to get the PlayStation 5 version. If you can release it in the next couple of weeks on Xbox, you put yourself still in a favorable position against Sony when it comes to this particular release, especially going into the holiday season where the game has that potential of being a sizable mover, not only of software, but maybe even a hardware mover. So it's going to be interesting when we see a release date for the game, but it could come as soon as, potentially next week, or
Yep.
maybe it'll be later in the year, but it's really in Larian and Microsoft's court right now as to when the game will be submitted and ready for release on the platform.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, you want to strike while the iron is hot. The hype surrounding Baldur's Gate is still very high. The PS5 version just came out. That's scoring extremely well. I think it's the PlayStation 5 version alone is kind of averaging 97 at the moment, which is
Yes,
one higher than the PC version, I believe.
yep, the highest rated game of 2023 right now.
Absolutely incredible. So yeah, you want to prepare and get that Xbox version out as soon as you can. And look,
Mhm.
Larian knows this. Like they've had the Xbox version ready to go, I think. And look, it's hard to really know if Larian set the meeting with Xbox, or if Xbox, wanted to talk to Larian about the difficulties they've been having. But I guess at the end of the day, it doesn't really make a huge difference, because the meeting did happen and the kind of the exemption was given. And
Mhm.
now, they can proceed with the Xbox version, which, again, like you said, probably we're going to see over the next few weeks.
I mean, with the meeting, I would have to say you would imagine that Microsoft may have initiated it, because had the game come in at a more subpar review score where it wasn't having massive sales on PC, would Microsoft really have felt all that motivated to approach the company and say, hey, we need to figure this out because it is coming up on the PlayStation 5 in just a few more weeks? And, you have come out and stated that it won't be until 2024 for our version. But if the game were just mediocre,
Yep.
you'd have to imagine Microsoft would have been like, that's fine. The game's not that big of a deal. No one's really that interested in it. But because the game was a gaming phenomenon, took the
Yeah.
world by storm, it kind of lights that fire under Microsoft where they have to approach the game with more urgency and say, hey, what's going on? Let's figure it out. And that allows me to segue into this topic, which is the waiver system, because it appears as though Baldur's Gate 3 is coming to the Xbox this year due to Microsoft granting a temporary waiver.
hmm
And you can go into a little more detail on that.
Yeah. So basically, when you submit a game for certification, usually the V1 version or the first version, in some scenarios, may not be complete, or it may be in a state where the developer or the publisher knows that there is a little more work to do. And a lot of the times you'll hear about developers working on a day one patch immediately after. But essentially, when you submit a game and your game is kind of tested for various things, aspects, sometimes things will get kicked back to you. So, for example, if I submit a game to Nintendo, Nintendo may submit or may send the game back and say, no, you failed. And these are the reasons why you failed. And they'll basically give you a list of things. And I think, and we'll get to the Xbox thing here in a sec, but I just want to kind of keep it high level for the moment. Now, in that scenario, you have the option to ask for what is known as a waiver. Now, in some scenarios, you won't get a waiver granted. So, for example, if I boot up the game and the game crashes immediately, right? I can't get a waiver for that because no one is going to grant you a waiver for that, right? But let's say the when I submit the game, and for whatever reason, if I save the game, but every like fifth time the game doesn't save properly or something like that, just something that's more, I guess, random, right? Some random bug that may come up, but it's something that potentially could be a certification issue. That's a scenario where you could apply for a waiver and say, look, we understand what you found. We're going to fix it. So a waiver basically is a commitment that you will address the particular thing later. Now, later could mean in a day one patch, or it could mean whenever, right? It could be version 1.1.2, 1.3. But basically, if your certification fails, you have the ability to then ask for a waiver on certain things. Now, the publisher or the hardware maker in this scenario, I should say, they can just turn around and say, no, we can't give you that waiver. You have to address the problem now before you proceed. And that's something that I've seen happen before. So I've been in scenarios where I have seen temporary waivers granted, and I have seen scenarios where waivers are not granted. Right now, in the case of Xbox, I guess we probably want to talk about parity between Series S and X, but I think the situation with a waiver in the case of Xbox is where something between Series S and X is potentially different. And what the messaging is around building Xbox Series games is the game needs to run across both, with parity, right? And when I say parity, I don't mean, it has to run at 4K on both systems, because that doesn't make any sense. But it has to be kind of functional and feature complete, in both, so you get the same experience, albeit on lower resolutions on Series S hardware. So yeah, I guess that's the best way I can describe what the waiver system is. A good example is the Cyberpunk 2077 mess that happened a few years ago. That was a situation where it, again, we don't know this firsthand, right? But we can only speculate what happened there. Obviously, Cyberpunk was released day one in a terrible, terrible state. It was a mess of bugs and crashes, and it was riddled with all sorts of issues. Most likely what happened there was CD Projekt Red asked for waivers, and they were given waivers. Now, do I agree that they were given waivers? I do not, but that's a completely different subject. But hopefully that answers what the question was here about waivers. It's really just a commitment to fix something later on, or to address something that was identified at a later date.
And that's what we're seeing here with Baldur's Gate 3, is that after they announced that the game will be coming to Xbox in 2023, Larian did further clarify that we will continue to work on local split screen co-op for the Series S. Now, they didn't make a firm commitment of we will deliver it. Their hope is that if they can get it out, if they can make it work, then they will patch it in at a later date on Series X and Series S. And largely, I agree with that decision. Bring the game out now. The game is complete. You have all the other modes operating fine. The game plays well on the system. The only thing that was holding it back was the local split screen. So why hold it hostage until you can figure out a solution? Bring it to the market. Let people play the game knowing that this mode is going to be absent from the release at the time. And that was the smart thing, is they were transparent, saying, we're going to bring the game, this mode won't be there, but if we can make it happen, we're going to continue to work on this, and we're going to hopefully be able to bring it to market at a later date. Let's say it is in 2024, though there is the reasonable chance it never happens. They're just not able to configure a solution. And the important thing is that the effort was made, and the release did come to the platform. And you could say, well, one of the things that Larian really prides itself on is that they wanted to make sure every release of the game had all the same content. And essentially, you are getting the exact same content in terms of game content. You're just not
Right.
getting the exact same content in terms of game mode offerings. And I have said on Twitter and elsewhere, how important is local split screen co op to the community? Because when you view a game like this, you really have to ask what is the percentage of people who are using this mode? And you can look at Microsoft as an example. They have Forza Motorsport coming out in October. They recently did a showcase for the game. And one of the talking points for them was about local split screen co op in the game. And they said, or Phil Spencer said, it was never going to be there. We have the data, we have the stats. Nobody uses it. So we committed our resources elsewhere in the game to make a more well rounded, more robust, full experience Forza game. And I commend them. That's the right decision. Because if it is a mode that no one is using, don't waste time and resources on it. And now I understand Baldur's Gate 3 is a different situation than a Forza game. This is a game where people are sitting down and playing the game. I'm not familiar all that much with the Baldur's Gate series. It's not something I have interest in. I have not played Baldur's Gate 3. So I'm going to ask the listeners, you can go into the comment section and respond in good faith. If you're going to be buying Baldur's Gate 3, or if you have bought it, are you playing local split screen co-op, or will you be playing local split screen co-op? Is it really that important of a feature to you? Because I genuinely want to know how many people are using this feature, or if it's really just kind of that situation of it's nice if it's there. I will never argue against options. Options should always be present. But is it one of those options that really, at the end of the day, if no one's using, this was the right call to make? Get the waiver and say, if we can patch it in, we will get to it.
Right.
But let us bring the game to market.
That's a really good point. I mean, I can't really speak to Baldur's Gate 3 either, because I haven't played it yet. I am planning on playing it, but it would be really nice to get some visibility on how, just exactly how many people are using the local co-op mode, or the split screen co-op mode, I should say. I mean, we can make our own assumptions and say, well, nothing will be lost if it goes away, and that's what it seems like. But I also want to make sure that this is not a feature that people actually are using a lot more than we think. But I mean, ultimately, the right decision was made here, I think, where temporary waiver was given, whatever you want to call it. But ultimately, the consumers win. Look, Xbox, they don't want to miss out on a game that had 250,000 concurrent players on Steam.
About 900,000.
Geez. Well, I take that back because that is a lot more than I thought. 900,000. They don't want it. They want a piece of that. Like they want to make money off this game, and why not? Like if you're Xbox, you're sitting on the sidelines because of some feature that the development house is struggling to implement on hardware. Of course, they're going to clear their schedule at Gamescom and take a meeting with Larian to see if they can make this work. So it only makes sense to me that this was done. But yeah, let's maybe see if we can get some people to let us know if there is actually folks out there that do use the local co-op. I mean, local co-op in many games is quite a popular feature, so I definitely don't want to discount it and say that it's not anything that was really that important, because I do want to get more visibility on that.
See, that's a curious thing that you mentioned there, because you say, it's an important feature, it's a popular feature. I would consider it a feature that is dying in the majority of cases, because really since the dawn of the Xbox 360, I would say local co-op in games has been pushed to the side, because you had online co-op that really took over, really resonated with the audience, because you had an older audience off to college or adults. You were playing Call of Duty 4, you were playing these games with your friends, and you no longer had to have LAN parties or have
Mm-hmm.
split screen co-op multiplayer where you had someone, screen cheating.
Right.
And you had Nintendo who still placed importance on local co-op. That's one of the phenomena around the Wii is that you could play together. And that's what made it such a social system. Whereas you could view the 360 and the PlayStation 3, and then by extension, the Xbox One, PS4, and even the current generation, as not that much of a social system. It's more of that online ecosystem, online social interactivity where online engagement is pivotal. That's why we have voice chat, party chat, the invitation systems, because local isn't that important to those console manufacturers when it comes to games. As mentioned earlier, Forza Motorsport no longer having local split screen co op due to the negligible percentage of individuals who would use it. And then you can look at some of the other bigger games like Halo Infinite does not have local split screen co
Oh
op for
yeah.
campaign. And if
Hold that thought. Was
Mhm.
that something that they just removed and said they weren't going to do, or was that something that they promised to add later? I forgot, to be honest. Did they just
um
say that they weren't going to do it? They just
yeah,
canceled it.
yeah, I believe
Yeah,
that's what happened there.
that's right.
And then it leaked that it runs fine on the Xbox One.
That's right. That's
And
right.
that caused the hour of if it runs, why aren't we getting it? And it was just we're not committing those resources to it. And I mean, and that's the curious thing is that is it a popular feature or is it really dying a slow death across the industry? And it's just Nintendo that keeps it alive with select games. And if it is dying, bravo to Larian for finding such importance behind this type of mode and trying to bring it to the home console scene.
Yeah.
And again, that's where that temporary waiver is kind of an important thing is that they're not giving up on it. It's that Microsoft still recognizes the importance of having that parity across all versions in terms of game modes, but they also recognize the importance of being able to deliver the game to their consumer base within a reasonable time period where it doesn't feel as though you missed out on the game if you have the Xbox. You're still getting the game, ideally very soon, and yes, you're not going to get this game mode, but again, as we put to the question to the audience, is it a mode you're truly utilizing? So it's definitely a curious thing. And, I'm going to be very interested in reading the responses we get in that inquisition about whether or not they use it. But I do want to go to the parity clause.
Well, hold that thought for a sec, Nate,
Okay.
because I just remembered that Baldur's Gate 3 was crowdfunded, I believe, on Kickstarter.
Okay.
And this goes all the way back to 2019.
Hmm.
So, actually, is that right? Larian
I mean,
Studios is making Baldur's Gate 3.
mhm. It
I,
went in early access. It was announced for Stadia.
right. Maybe it wasn't Kickstarter, but my point is this. It was crowdfunded. So it wasn't, done kind of the traditional way, which means that they would have made commitments to their player base about the features they were going to provide, which would have included, for better or for worse, local split screen
Mhm.
co-op. That was a feature that either people had requested and they said yes we would do, or they had in their kind of feature list. So I
Mhm.
think that's a little different than just just saying, oh, we'll get rid of it because no one wants it or whatever. Like if
Right.
if their active player base requested it as part of their crowdfunding, then I can see why they had hesitation in just getting rid of it in the first
Mhm.
place.
Yeah, I mean, that would be a good point, is that if this is something that they feel is a promise and a commitment to their base, then yeah, it definitely resonates as to why they place such importance on it and why they were so adamant of we want to have it there. When we deliver the game, we want it there. And they have been working to make it happen. Microsoft has sent some of their engineers to Larian to try to figure out how to make this possible as well.
Right.
And, I'm sure all of this was discussed in that meeting. And,
Yeah.
you know, ultimately they did come to that proper conclusion of Let's get the game out. We can work on it. And I mean, one of the big things that came up after that meeting was the parity clause. But actually, no, I want to go back to the waiver system again
Mm-hmm.
because actually, no, we'll go to parity.
Let's go to parity.
So what we see with the parity system, it came up out of the meeting that, well, what's the future going to be when it comes to other Series S games that could potentially have issue with delivering a game mode, be it local, split screen co-op, or any other game mode it may, a game could potentially feature. And people were saying, does this set a new precedent moving forward for the Xbox Series line, where you're going to have developers and publishers asking Microsoft for a temporary waiver or just an exemption from having a select mode be available on the Series S. And when you look through Xbox's history, parity can change. It's an ever evolving situation. And we can go back to the Xbox Live Arcade service way back on the 360, where when it launched, you could not have a game eclipse 50 megabytes. That's right, 50 megabytes.
Yeah. Do you remember why? Because they had that Xbox 360 arcade that had that little memory card and the 4 gigabyte like storage space.
Yep.
So they really, really wanted to make sure that all their games you could download from XBLA would fit and be playable on the 360 arcade.
But all of that changed. And it changed because a little game from Konami was coming to Xbox Live Arcade. And that game was Castlevania Symphony of the Night. And this was a game of far too much importance to Microsoft and just gaming in general to kick aside. You wanted this game on your platform. It's iconic. It's legendary. It's one of the most important Metroidvania games of all time. And Microsoft recognized that. And what do? They changed the limitations on Xbox Live Arcade. And eventually, this led to a lot of changes in digital services because eventually we would get full retail games offered on the Xbox store.
Yep, games on demand. I remember that. You're right. Like it was 50 megabytes, and it was 50 megabytes for like maybe a year and a half or 2 years. And then Symphony of the Night came out, which is obviously 500 megabytes or probably even larger than that. So they relaxed that restriction. But I remember that they relaxed the restriction multiple times after that. So I think after Symphony of the Night, they had like a 1 gigabyte limit. And then they increased that to 2 gigabytes. And I think outside of games on demand, Xbox Live Arcade games, I think like the largest one that I can remember was Far Cry Red. What's it called? Red Faction. What's that 80s Far Cry game?
Oh, Far Cry Dragon.
Yeah, something.
Neon Dragon.
Neon Dragon. It still doesn't sound right, but you know the one I'm talking about. That ended up being, I think, about 2 point something gigabytes. So yeah, Microsoft did, relax the restrictions on XBLA due to, like you said, really high profile games that came out that had no way of of ever fitting in a 50 megabyte space. I mean, that was just never going to work for Symphony of the Night. So you're right. They have in history gone back and relaxed some requirements that they've previously had. And this is really no exception with Baldur's Gate 3.
It was Far Cry Blood Dragon.
Thank you.
That's it.
I said Red Dragon or Red Faction.
Red Dragon.
I don't know why I said
Neon Dragon. We see Neon Dragon makes sense because we did have a Double Dragon Neon.
That's right.
So that's close. But yeah, to your point, they have made exemptions. They have relaxed certain clauses when there is an example or a release that calls for it. And that's what Baldur's Gate 3 is here, is that this is a major release. They see the value in having it on their platform, and they're looking at the parity clause of saying if it's on Series S and Series X, you have to have the same modes, have to have those same features. Even though Phil Spencer has come out and said this is a fan theory, it leaked way back when the Series X launched that there is a parity clause stating this in the official SDK documents. So I'm not sure how it's a fan theory when it leaked.
100%. 100%. You have to have the same game across both. You have to. Like, I think, if I tried to submit a game on Series X and S that had some features removed from Series S, I would get an automatic fail. They'd be like, well, what is this? Why is this feature here and it's not over here? And I can't turn around and say, well, because you did it for Baldur's Gate 3.
Well, you could try.
I mean, I could try. I would just get a fail. I couldn't even get a waiver for it. They would just say no. Get it done.
I mean, and that's the thing. Like, will there be exemptions moving forward? I think it's going to be in a very exclusive case by case basis. It's going to be for games that are of an elite tier. So if Grand Theft Auto 6 comes to market and they say, hey, this particular co-op feature really doesn't run well on Series S, can we get an exemption and give us that temporary waiver where we can patch it in a little later? And maybe they grant it, and maybe they do look at it and give it a full-on pardon of you don't have to patch in that feature, but we have to make it clear.
Yeah.
That when we're marketing the game and all the press releases, everything, it's clear that Series S does not have this game mode. And, I think that will work for them. I'm not saying it's necessarily a great solution, because ideally you do have the exact same game modes both, across both platforms. But as this generation kicks on and games become more complex as they begin to utilize all of the feature sets of the Series X and even the PlayStation 5, the Series S is going to begin to potentially struggle with certain releases. And it's going to depend on the game itself and what it's trying to do. With Baldur's Gate, the split screen co-op is just very demanding because it's rendering the game twice, as one player can go wherever they want on the map and another player can go to the other side. So that's a lot. If it were just, a single screen with limited movement, maybe it wouldn't be as much of a stressor
right
on the system itself and the hardware. So it's all going to come down to implementation and the game in question. So I don't think we're going to encounter too many of these scenarios as the generation advances. Yes, there may be a case here or there, like Grand Theft Auto 6, some of these bigger, wider games. And with Baldur's Gate 3, it's simply a case of what our vision is. It's really not working out that well on the Series S. But it's also important to keep in mind, they never came out and said this is an impossibility. They simply said, we need more time to optimize and figure this out.
Yep, exactly. The other thing that I can't help but think about when it comes to the Xbox ecosystem is that you have this amazing ability to play anywhere, right? So you can play the same game on your Xbox Series X, you can play it on your Series S, you can play it on your PC, and your save files will seamlessly be available to you no matter where you play. And I love that feature. I think it's fantastic. I'm playing Starfield right now and I'm kind of flip-flopping between PC and Xbox. My save file is right there. I can just play anywhere I want, and that's awesome. I think one of the difficult parts about having a Series S version that has, we'll just say, some features removed, and we won't be specific about the local co-op, is that you have to be very, very careful that your save file doesn't screw anything up in that scenario. So let's say the Baldur's Gate 3 save file had metadata about the local co-op that you are currently playing, or the local split screen, and it had, I'll just say, player positions and maybe just inventory and basic statistics. When you move over to your Series S, what happens in that scenario? Obviously, that data doesn't really go anywhere because that functionality doesn't exist. So I think they're the kind of difficulties that that I think Xbox is trying to avoid when they say, look, we want parity everywhere. So we know that your save file, your game experience will work everywhere you go without any issues. And I think in the case of local split screen co-op, it's probably not that big of a deal. But let's say GTA 6 does come out, right? For Series S, and there's some part of that game that's too demanding, and they have to take it away. You're right. I think GTA 6 is a big enough and an important enough game. It's going to literally print money on any platform that runs on. That yes, Microsoft is probably going to be in a situation where if there was an issue with Series S with that game, that they would grant a similar type of waiver so the game could come out. But they would have to be, I think, very, very careful that your save file, your experience still is a good one across their entire ecosystem. I mean, this is what Microsoft built. This is their plan the whole time. They want you playing Xbox no matter where you are and having a great experience no matter where you're playing. So by what they're saying, they're basically telling you that you're going to have all the same features available to you no matter where you are. So this is definitely not that at all, right? It's something where something is a little different on Series S. So, they set the rules. And yeah, I think ultimately any type of exemptions or waivers that are given will be on an extreme case-by-case basis, where I think if the game is not a guarantee, I mean, in the case of Baldur's Gate, they already knew that this game was selling very, very well, and it was performing very, very well. So I think it was easy for Microsoft to say, "Yep, we'll give you that waiver. We'll let you proceed." But I think, yeah, Grand Theft Auto. Look, I don't even think Call of Duty would be good enough to make the cut. Like it has to be something significant, I think, for them to say, we're going to grant an exemption here for some Series S functionality.
I want to propose an alternative solution, and it is not one that I am advocating for, because I think it would invite just a shitstorm if Microsoft ever went this route. But I do want to propose it and just hear your thoughts on it, because I think it is a terrible solution. But here we'll use Baldur's Gate 3 as the example, since it's the game we're talking about. We have local split screen co-op working on Series X. It does not work on Series S. So instead of it giving you a native Series S version, we're going to give you a native Series X version. And if you want to play it on Series S, you have to stream it.
Right. I thought about that. I was actually thinking about that as I was saying my little bit just before. I was like, well, maybe they could do that. That's definitely a solution. But I also feel like you would probably upset your consumer base more that way, because at that point you're saying, well, why did you buy a Series S for, right? And I think the other difficult part is you're in a situation now where you're relying on people's internet connections. Here in the US, it's fine, but there are other places in the world where it may not be as good. So, yeah, but I did give that some thought. Maybe they could offer just a streaming version for Series S. And look, who knows, Nate? I mean,
no.
Well, I mean, 5 or 6 years from now, when Series X and S is still the system of choice, even though they're at the tail end, where's the Series S going to be? And I think a lot of people are asking questions about the Series S. I don't want to use that stupid phrase "holding the generation back," because I think that's an absurd take. I really do. But you do have to wonder, if Phil is true to his word and he's saying we're still not really interested in a mid-gen refresh, that Xbox Series XX or Series SS, whatever the Pro models are, Like, if that's something that Microsoft is truly not interested in looking at right now, then you do have to wonder what the Series S is going to be 3, 4, 5 years from now. It may be in a situation where they could be resorting to cloud streaming, which hopefully they're not. But I am very, very curious to see how much we're going to see out of the Series S over the next few years.
And I think largely it's going to come down to the games, the games that are coming to the platform. Because Baldur's Gate 3, let's be honest, isn't like the majority of games coming from other developers.
Mm-mm.
This is a fairly demanding game in terms of how it employs co op. Because keep in mind, there's nothing about the single player that caused issue. It's
Right.
strictly the local split screen co op. And it's just the way how the game renders it twice and all of that. That's a lot of headroom. You need the RAM, CPU, GPU to do all of that 2 times over, especially at a good resolution. So you can see where the Series S might be sitting there saying, okay, you're breaking my knees a bit here. You're asking me to do a lot. But generally, we haven't seen a game come to the Series S that has been an outright disaster. Like, yes, we did have Immortals just come out from EA, and the Series S resolution is atrocious. But I mean, that's a game utilizing Unreal Engine 5. It's from a relatively smaller development studio.
Yeah.
Where will the game be in 6 months or even 12 months after a series of patches?
Right. And see, even that I don't really put too much stock in. You can't take that and say, look, this is why the Series S is holding back the generation, because
Right.
Unreal Engine 5 is so new. Like, I can count the number of games that run on UE5 on one hand right now. You know what I mean? So
Mhm.
in any studio that takes a plunge with UE5, they're going to have teething problems at the beginning. But the studio that developed that game, in another way, they've already got their first UE5 kind of product out of the way. So their next game is going to be, they're going to learn from the mistakes of this one and do
Right.
do better and iterate. So look, UE5, I don't put too much stock into that holding back the Series S. I think it's still
Right.
such a new engine technology, and
And
it'll only improve over time.
I mean, that's the thing. Unreal Engine 5 is still a work in progress.
Oh yeah,
It's still
absolutely.
being improved by Epic. And when you look at some of the other games coming to Series S, you have Alan Wake 2 coming out later this year. You have Forza coming out next month. You just had Starfield come to Series S. This system is still handling these games. And again, like Baldur's Gate may be the exception to the rule when it comes to certain performance requirements to do a select single mode. Where again, we didn't see or hear that the campaign was experiencing any issues. So if it's really just co-op,
Yeah.
the Series S isn't holding anything back, and we have seen no evidence to suggest the Series S is holding back. Some developers have gone to Twitter where they've said, yes, the Series S has complicated our development a bit because we do have to target a lower profile when we're coming to the Xbox that we don't have to do with really any other platform.
Yeah, but
And
look, I don't want to be nitpicky, but the folks that have come out and been kind of critical of the Series S, are they actually developers that are writing code, or are they, community managers, or in other kind of development roles? Because I don't really think I've seen any actual developer that is writing code against hardware making any type of take about the Series S. I could be wrong,
I mean,
but I haven't seen anything.
it probably would be an ill-advised move to do.
Right.
And I mean, that's the thing. Like, you had some comments about Alan Wake, but ultimately, the game's coming to both series platforms same day as PlayStation 5 and PC. So that would suggest to me that there was no meaningful obstacle to overcome.
Mhm.
Like, maybe it took you a few more weeks to optimize the Series S version.
That's
development.
You hit the nail on the head. The concern, and I'm using air quotes when I say the concern, is that no studio wants to target two separate SKUs of the same platform. Like you've dialed in a Series X version that runs really, really well. And now all of a sudden it's like, okay, now we've got to focus on the Series S version. Meanwhile, on PlayStation, you have one version. Meanwhile, on Nintendo, you have one version. So I think it's really just developers or studios. You know, there's some frustration that they have to prepare two SKUs for one piece of hardware. And I think that's really what it comes down to. There's nothing inherently wrong with the Series S. I think the Series S is more than capable of getting the job done in almost every scenario, right? But it's really just about, well, we have to now focus our resources on getting the Series S version running properly.
And that's kind of the ironic thing is how Microsoft approached this generation, is that you had Digital Foundry say a few months ago that it seemed as though Microsoft brought out the Series S as their next generation system. And instead of doing a mid-gen refresh, they launched their mid-gen refresh with the Series X. But what we're seeing is, instead of developers creating for the Series S first and then upporting to the Series X, like you will do potentially next year when we have the base PlayStation 5 and we're going to have a PlayStation 5 Pro, they're doing it in reverse. They're targeting Series X because, let's be honest, that's the base for next generation with the PlayStation 5. The Series S is the outlier here.
Correct.
And so now they're downscaling it and saying, well, when we were designing and developing this game, this wasn't in our initial vision because we're targeting those two platforms, in this case, PS5 and Series X. And that's kind of introduced some of the problems. Had Baldur's Gate 3 started as a console game and they started with the Series S version first, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Right.
Because the game would have been tailored for those specifications.
But no one builds against the Series S first. That's just not the way things are done. Like, I've worked on a few Xbox projects myself, and you always start with the Series X because, of course, you do, right? Like, you don't start with the smaller thing. But I get your point. Like, if you did start on the Series S and you kind of optimized around that, things would have been different. Like, you know, there's always, I hear people talk about how, you know, you should work on the Nintendo Switch version first, right? I mean, that's great in theory, but that usually doesn't happen in practice. You usually either start on PC or you start on PlayStation 5 or you start on Xbox Series. That's just the way things are done. I couldn't imagine starting a project and targeting Series S first and then be like, okay, now let's get all these visuals running at 4K so we can run it on Series S. It just doesn't make sense. You kind of start up and then you kind of scale down versus the other way around.
And that's really what's causing some of the issues here, is that optimization time. And that's where I do believe Microsoft will not have a mid-gen refresh. Because if you introduce a third development profile to the Xbox line,
oh my God,
I feel like you're just begging for trouble.
Developers going to quit.
Do it.
Like, how can you? Yeah, that's giving me just all sorts of bad vibes. Hearing you say that, like, if there was literally 3 SKUs that you had to target, I mean, that would just completely blow out your budget and your development costs. It would be ridiculous to think about.
Especially considering the gap between a Series S and a Series X Pro.
Right.
Could be in the magnitude of 5 times the, raw power in terms of teraflops, and never mind getting into RAM, which could be, 3 times more, and, GPU, CPU, it could be significant. So that's why I believe Microsoft won't do a mid-gen refresh, is they kind of position themselves in a way of, we can't support that.
Do you think, though, that maybe the generation will not be as long as a normal generation? Maybe they'll reduce it by maybe 18 months, 2 years?
Uh, what do we consider a traditional generation at this point? Because we
Oh,
used to have, those 5-year generations, and then we had the abnormally long generation with the PS3 360.
right.
So, what do you want to consider normal?
6 years,
Factor in
maybe?
COVID of 2020 and how it kind of delayed the generation a couple of years as well.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think we see a next gen successor from Microsoft in 2027.
I was going to say 28. And I only say that because apparently there's a new Elder Scrolls game coming out around then. So I kind of figure it's coming out with new hardware. So yeah, look, 27, 28, end of 27, beginning of 28, I could see
Mhm.
new hardware.
Yeah, I mean, I think 2020, the impacts of COVID, how that impacted software development and even the hardware rollout in terms of manufacturing and procuring enough units to bring to shelves, I think may have extended the generation a year or two, maybe 18 months. I think I could see Microsoft bringing out a next gen successor around 2027.
Right.
Maybe begin talking about it in 2026, but it's still plenty of time from now. And the last topic I want to touch on is Baldur's Gate 3 has now launched on the PlayStation 5. So we now have footage and analysis of how local split screen co op works on a home console. And initial testing is not promising. It dips into the low 20s on the PlayStation 5. So this kind of brings me back to the start of the episode. If local split screen co op isn't performing admirably, even on the PlayStation 5, do you, as Larian, have to make that executive decision of it runs, we can give it to our base, we can give it to our fans, but this is not the optimal way of playing our game in a co-op setting. Like, we still have the online co-op that runs fine, but if local is dipping into the low 20s, do you make that executive decision of just saying it doesn't run that well on home consoles, and maybe we just won't? Maybe we shouldn't have offered it at all.
Yeah. I think so. I mean, I'm actually surprised to hear you say the performance. I haven't really kept up to date on where the frame rates were, but if it's dipping into the low 20s on PlayStation 5, then yeah, I mean, you can, even based on that, you can automatically kind of get the sense of the struggles and the difficulties they were having with Series S is probably
Mhm.
dipping into the low teens, to be honest with you, on Series S, which is
Yeah,
probably
like
why, right?
I've only seen one analysis for it, so
Hmm.
I'm using good faith here that this wasn't a bias
Yep.
analysis. It didn't have a secret agenda to try to make the PlayStation 5 look worse than it really is. So if the information is fraudulent, I will proactively apologize
Right.
for this, for this particular segment here. But it still brings up the interesting talking point of if it isn't, let's just say for the sake of discussion, in theory, it isn't running well on PlayStation 5. Even if you want to have parity across all versions of your game, what do you deem to be acceptable performance before you look at it and say, we just can't deliver it on a home console?
I mean, you can't have a game that basically is running like a slideshow and say that's acceptable performance. Like the last time I remember this happening on Xbox was, do you remember when they released PUBG for console on Xbox One? And it was
Yes.
just terrible, 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 terrible. And basically they came out and said, we're aware of it, we're fixing it. And you tell me, Nate, did they ever fix it properly on Xbox One? I don't feel like they ever did. I feel like they
I
got to a point where they just couldn't really optimize it any further.
I don't believe they did, but it was also a game I'd never followed that closely or played. So
I played it for a little while, and we obviously like playing Warzone, so we like kind of our battle royales. I played it a little while on PC, and I remember when they made the announcement that it was coming to Xbox. Did they buy the IP? I don't remember. But anyway, it was coming to Xbox, and I was really excited to play it on my Xbox One VCR at the time, which now that I think back, what was I thinking, right? But it was terrible. Like, it literally would just freeze for like 2 seconds as you were like parachuting in into onto the land and everything, and it wasn't very good. And at that point, I remember Microsoft was saying, "Yep, we're fixing it. We're going to fix it. We got ATG on it, the Advanced Technology Group," and they never really were able to get it running very well. And I think this is the same scenario that's happened here, because there were talks that Larian did have the Xbox Advanced Technology Group working with them to figure out what was going on with this game. And I wonder if, the executive decision that was made by Phil at Gamescom was because they had exhausted all other options, but the game was too big just to ignore at the end of the day.
That is how it feels. And, again, I still think it's the right call to make.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you want to make your customers happy. This is a good move for your customers. Yes, there are going to be people that are disappointed that there is no local co-op. There are probably people that play local co-op. But yeah, ultimately this move is the right move to make. Now, whether the Series S is to blame for this, it's hard to really say with what information we have. But basically, if Larian has been working away at this and they are continuing to work on it to try to get it done, I mean, that does tell you that yes, there is a bottleneck here. And if you look at, like you said, the PlayStation 5 numbers, and we will say that we're not 100% sure if those numbers are accurate, but we have some confidence. Then yeah, I mean, this is definitely the right move to make.
Mm-hmm. Like, I did check out a couple of videos right now, and a common thing is that it does have just frame rate issues on the PlayStation 5, even in solo.
Right.
So it could be, it depends if you're playing in quality and performance mode potentially for that local co-op as to where the performance will find itself and settle. And the video I saw doing the analysis didn't specify which. So it could be higher than the number I quoted earlier. It could be lower, but I do, I would fully expect that Digital Foundry will have a full synopsis and breakdown in the near future.
Mm-hmm.
And again, treat this section as more of a, if the PlayStation 5 version is running poorly, then concrete that it is. So just proceed with caution on this particular few-minute segment, just because we're not sure whether or not the account had any agenda to make the PlayStation 5 look worse than it is, which is unfortunate that we kind of live in the era where people will go to YouTube and social media and misrepresent figures or outright create fraudulent figures just to support their favorite system. But with that, we can go to some of the Streamlabs questions for this week. If you'd like to support the channel, we have a Streamlabs link in our description below. Donate any dollar amount, ask a question. We will answer the question at the end of the episode, that is. And our first question for this week comes from Waiting for P6, who donated $9.63. And they write, "Hey, I remember some speculation a few months ago about Persona 6 releasing as PlayStation 5 exclusive. Just wanted to ask if you've heard anything else on this front and whether you think we'll end up seeing a multi-platform release or not. Thanks." It will be PlayStation 5 exclusive in terms of the PlayStation family. As for whether or not it comes to the Xbox, I don't have any further clarity on that. My particular contact on the matter was only aware of a PlayStation 5 version of the game, though they never outright dismissed the possibility of it coming to Xbox. So I can only comment on what I have been told. Though when you look at Microsoft and Atlas's relationship over the last several months, I would say it is well within reason that Persona 6 could come to the Xbox Series S and X. The only thing that would prevent it is if Sony had made a deal with Atlas, a couple of years back on the title. And that's something I don't have any insight into. But I do not dismiss the possibility of it coming to Xbox. All I can say is it will not come to PlayStation 4. Then had a $10 donation from the Ally Phase. Hey there, a little while ago there was a leak for Oblivion being remastered. What is the likelihood of this considering the huge mod Skyblivion is Bethesda endorsed? Seems odd they would approve a mod that competes with their product. Thanks.
I don't know anything about the Oblivion mod that you mentioned, and I will say that I'm not an expert on the overall modding scene. I know that there are some very, very good ones out there. Look, I think at the end of the day, if there is going to be an Oblivion remake or remaster, it's really about getting it into all the various ecosystems that people have already invested in. Obviously, the mod that you talk about is one that is very, very good. But look, I will say it's very similar to what we do with the Carbon Engine stuff, and that is rather than you as in the user or the player seeking out these mods and learning how they work and installing them, it's just so much easier just to offer a package and present it to you and provide it to a customer in such a way where they don't have to mess around with anything. So look, I think this mod is probably exceptionally good, but it's also easy for me to say, oh, Oblivion is coming out for the Nintendo Switch. I'm just going to buy a copy and then I'm going to play it. And I think that's the mindset of a lot of customers, especially ones that have a lot of nostalgia for, older 360 titles.
Yeah, there is a sizable percentage of people who aren't in the mod scene or don't have PCs to do it. So there is incentive for Bethesda to want to remaster a game like that and bring it to all the home consoles.
Yeah, it's same as emulation. Like,
right,
you can download if I take the Jurassic Park collection that I'm currently working on right now, you can play any of those games on an emulator today. There's nothing stopping you from doing that and have the exact same experience and maybe a better experience. But if you want a licensed product, a very well curated product that is already available to you in such a way where you don't have to mess around with the legalities of ROMs and BIOSes and things and configuration files and all that stuff, then you just buy a commercial product.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, there's also the chance that the remaster was an active project that maybe won't come to market. It could have been something that they were shopping around. There's also that chance too. But it's something we'll find out in the future. If it never gets announced, then we know. Then had a $2.22 donation from Lazy Generation. Hey, Nate and MVG. What do I have to do for EA to remaster Burnout 3? I'm willing to pay extra if they get all the songs too. Ooh. Do I need to buy all the EA shares? Do I have to become CEO? Don't they want money? Hello, EA. Criterion is stuck making NFS games.
Is that Burnout 3 Takedown? Because if that's Takedown,
I believe so.
And I am 100% on board. I would love to see Burnout 3 Takedown.
Man, Burnout used to be a good series.
It was a fantastic series.
And then
good times.
Kind of burned out.
There's probably next to zero chance that any of that's going to happen, unfortunately. But I would love to see Burnout 3 Takedown. I'm with you there, buddy. Let's get it back.
Then had a $3.26 donation from Not Lucky. MVG, why don't put games on USB sticks? For a console, you don't need a disk drive, and you have still physical medium.
You know, this is not a bad idea. I mean, it may sound a little silly initially, but there's definitely some merit to just offering a USB stick with the game on it. Look, at the end of the day, this is how it works. Publishers want more control over how they serve up their games to their customers. Hardware makers also want more control about how they serve up games to their customers. And the easiest and most controllable way is to offer them on digital storefronts. It's simple as that, with certificates that can expire or ones that are in perpetuity as long as the storefront is available. We have talked about this before, not necessarily USB sticks, but we kind of joked around about how why doesn't Xbox have a game on their expansion card thing?
Yep.
You plug it in the back.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they could do it. There's really nothing stopping them from doing it other than it would obviously incur a cost that would be pushed onto the customer.
Could you imagine how expensive a game would be?
It would be very expensive.
Like, you can buy Starfield for $300.
Right.
What?
And then it would get a patch like 2 days later and render your copy worthless. But yeah, I mean, look, at the end of the day, digital storefronts and digital kind of delivery systems are the way of the future. I don't necessarily agree with it, but publishers, hardware makers, they want to control their games better.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you put them on a USB stick, I can plug that USB stick into my PC. I can start snooping around at the files.
That's true. Ben had a $3.69 donation from South Coast Horizon. Want to deep dive this? From the last episode, a question asked about modern Galaxy 2. Why is this so difficult or omitted? Nintendo developers are smart enough to figure out the modern control issue with Yoshi. Why would they skip remastering this game? Because of Yoshi.
Yeah, I think because of Yoshi.
They can't figure out a reasonable control style to handle Yoshi and his tongue action. And that's why they haven't remastered it yet. I know it sounds like something they can solve for. And maybe they've done various testing for the controls and they just haven't come up with a solution that they're comfortable with. So if we ever get Galaxy 2, maybe there's an additional input on a future controller. Maybe they just remake it and they streamline Yoshi's functionality to an AI or auto acts in certain scenarios. But for whatever reason, they cannot figure out that Yoshi.
It's difficult, trying to port some of these old Wii games and 3DS games where there was reliance on, various features of the hardware. Like, I think about Skyward Sword on the Switch, which is a pretty good port, let's be honest. Overall, they did a good job. But the controls, the updated controls, in my opinion, and someone's going to get mad at me, but in my opinion, I couldn't stand the updated controls. They just didn't feel right to me at all. I just went back to the motion controls. And I think, that is the most difficult part of these games, making sure that when you bring them across, that you don't lose something in translation. And I think personally, a game like Skyward Sword did lose something in translation. And look, for all we know, they may already have builds of Mario Galaxy 2 already running on Switch. It's quite possible considering they've done Galaxy 1. And maybe they just felt like we still haven't got this right yet. We still haven't figured this out. But, it'll be interesting to see if we ever see it. I'm of the camp that we probably won't until next gen. And even then, I'm not sure personally.
Yeah, it's hard to say what's going to happen with it. I mean, it's a fantastic game. Hopefully, it is not lost to time.
Hopefully not.
But we will find out. And our last question comes from Goose77E, who donated $3 and writes, developer question. I hear a lot of talk regarding Starfield. The mods will fix a lot of problems. Why should it end? Why should it be up to mods to fix some of the problems and not the developers who have years to make the game? How are mods able to add DLSS so fast?
Well, the DLSS discussion is interesting because I believe, I don't know this for a fact, right? But it seems like there was some type of partnership or deal made between AMD and Bethesda for Starfield, because there is no DLSS implementation at all. There's all talk about AMD processors, but there's really nothing about Intel and NVIDIA. And I will say that as someone who is playing Starfield on PC, it's not very well optimized for NVIDIA. So I don't know if this is a situation where, Bethesda, half baked this or released this game half baked and missed some important features, rather than it being basically they are in bed with AMD and all they were really asked to work on was an FSR implementation for the game. Now, with that said, there are other aspects of the game that modders have addressed, such as FOV sliders and things like that. Look, ultimately, games have to get shipped, right? Like they have to go out the door, and sometimes they go out the door with features that are not implemented. Look, I think eventually we will see FOV sliders and various other features make their way to Starfield, but the modding community is there to basically work on these things, and they've always done stuff like this. So I don't really think it's the fault of the developer or the publisher. It's really just the case of you got to ship the game out, and having an FOV slider, for example, that's not in play is an issue for some people. But for many people that are playing the game, it's not really that important to them. But hey, I think eventually we will see those features, and maybe a DLSS implementation get added later on. But I think there's definitely some weird marketing or some partnership between AMD and Bethesda on this one.
Yeah, we see a lot of these deals with AMD partnering with select games. And I believe AMD did come out and say, we didn't prevent any DLSS implementation, but I mean, taking the word of a corporation who had a marketing deal, maybe it wasn't stipulated in clear language that it wasn't allowed, but it could have been one of those underlying things of don't.
It's like when that Take-Two president said, there's nothing stopping the developers from adding. What was the question?
There's nothing stopping Double 11 from announcing Red Dead Redemption for PC,
right?
Except you're literally stopping that.
Exactly. It's just, I don't know. It's just a PR response, really.
It's don't blame us. We didn't do it, but we did. But we're not going to say it because we want you to like us,
right?
And but that is our last Streamlabs question for this week. If you'd like to support the channel, we have a Streamlabs link in the description below. Donate any dollar amount, ask a question. We will answer it at the end of the episode. Donate $100 or more, and we will dedicate the episode to you. And with that, I'd like to thank MVG for joining me as always.
Always a pleasure, Nate. Now I'm going to go and play some Starfield.
As am I. But let us know your thoughts in the comment section below on Baldur's Gate 3 coming to Xbox, when you think it will come to Xbox, if you play local split screen co-op, and if it is an important feature to you, or if you kind of view it as it's not that important, you could have scrapped it and we would have been fine. But let us know in the comment section below. And if you liked the video, give it a like. If you didn't, give it a dislike. And until next time, continue to embrace the hate.